And when this is over, what we'll do is we'll share it to everybody, all the members, and we really need to learn about school funding and how it works because it is very complicated. And I think this is my third time hearing this presentation, and I'm excited because I pick up something new every single time. So I'm gonna just let you all lead it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Demeter. I'm here with my colleague Noah. We are 2/5 of the small but mighty team at the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, and we are just so excited to be with you tonight. It has felt like a really uplifting week of advocating for disability rights and education justice. Was really happy to be at the rally on Tuesday morning with our team, able to provide some resources for people who are interested in learning more about special education funding in New Hampshire public schools. So we're here tonight to talk about how that happens in public schools. I want to give just a really quick overview of what our organization does. As I said, we are a small team. We are based out of Concord, and we actually all live in different parts of the state, which is a really neat perspective because one of the reasons why we organize and talk about this subject is because the different areas of New Hampshire have such different experiences from a taxpayer perspective and from a public school student and public school teacher perspective regarding how education is borne out from community to community. So us being from different parts of the states or different parts of the state are really cool because it gives us that perspective in real life. So what we do is we advocate to make school funding more equitable for students and taxpayers alike. And you're going to hear that throughout our presentation tonight. One of the things that our group does most is we go around to different communities because all those communities are so different. And we talk specifically to people within those communities about how education is funded within their own school system and how that might differ from people who are living even just next door in a neighboring district. And so that is a really important aspect of what we do. But tonight we're here to take a version of that presentation and expand it to include more conversation about special education funding specifically. So that's what we're going to do tonight. Noah, if you can advance to the next slide. Thank you. So we're going to answer a few questions tonight. I just put this right at the beginning, and then we're going to revisit it a little bit at the end to kind of guide us through this conversation. First and foremost, we're going to set that foundation and talk about how New Hampshire does fund its public education system. And then we're going to talk about why it's unfair to these two populations that we think about so much, which is the students and the taxpayers. We're going to talk about how special education services are affected by the way that our funding system currently operates. And then finally, kind of wrap that all up together with what we as citizens and community members and parents and people experiencing a disability, what we can do to change the system. So that's the lay of the lands. We're going to try to get through it. We've got 1 hour, and we're hoping to leave a little room at the end for questions and answers. But we would really encourage you, as questions bubble up, which we hope they do throughout this presentation, we really encourage you either like raise your hands, do that virtual hand raise thing that Zoom lets you do, or type a question into the chat. I don't want you to hold on to something all the way until the very end if it's something that will help you learn throughout as we go. So please use the chat function. We're happy to kind of just pause and answer questions in the moment if you want to ask them in the moment. All right, let's move on. Next slide, Noah. Oh, thanks. Perfect. Okay, so where does education come from? Where does education funding come from? New Hampshire is an anomaly within the state or within the country because the way we fund education and the way really we fund pretty much most everything we need is largely through our property taxes. And this is very different from 48 other states in our country. Other states use a combination of income tax and sales tax and property tax to fund these things. But New Hampshire only relies on its property tax primarily. There are other small things like we have income coming from the lottery, and we have business tax and meals and rooms tax and tax on alcohol and tax on cigarettes and things like that. But by and large, the funding stream for education is largely coming from property tax. So what that means is that when we have communities that are near these natural, beautiful locations like lakes or the ocean, when they're near ski mountains and other things that draw people to them, usually those towns have a higher property tax or property value. So what they can do because of that higher property value is that they can lower the tax rates and still end up raising plenty of money for their schools. Yes, Joanne, you asked, will the slides be shared after? We're happy to share the slides after. Yeah, absolutely. I can send those to Lewis and he can pass them out. So I hope I'm not over-promising, Lewis. Okay, great. Yeah, we're happy to share the slides out after. So what we're going to be learning in an upcoming slide is that the state of New Hampshire only contributes a small percentage of the actual cost of education. So local communities have to pay for that remainder by taxing their own residents to make up that difference. So in towns with these high property values, the ones that have proximity to lakes, to the ocean, to ski mountains, their tax rates usually are very low and their schools are still usually really well funded and produce high performing students. We're going to take a look at that too in a couple upcoming slides. But if that's true, what ends up happening is the opposite is also true. In economically depressed communities, there's far less of that property wealth, which means that to make up the money that they need to fund their education system, they have to set their tax rates very high. And that only allows them often to raise even a modest amount of money, even though their schools remain underfunded. So we're going to dig more into that contrast later as well. Let's pop into the next slide, Noah. I am parenting and doing this at the same time. We have a dog with a squeaky toy in the other room. That's fun. Okay, so let's dig into some more of the specifics. New Hampshire's education funding system is really complicated, and I'm going to start with that because what I haven't yet told you about myself is that this is now my 4th year sitting on the Dover School Board. So I get the opportunity to dig into this through my service in that capacity. It was very daunting and overwhelming for me to start thinking about this. When I joined the school board, and it still feels daunting to me in my 4th year. So if it feels confusing to you, welcome. You're in good company here. Our goal is to break it down into understanding it in a way that feels a little more simple, but it's never going to be easy. It's all very confusing, and we're not even getting into like the other half of the really confusing stuff. So if we break it down into these simple categories right now, the way that New Hampshire funds its public education system is in a couple of different tiers. Every single student receives an amount of money that is called base adequate education aid. This year, for 24-25 school year, that number is $4,182. So every student receives that baseline. That's the amount that the state of New Hampshire has decided is enough, is sufficient to provide an adequate education. So even though every student gets that, some students we know require extra services, which therefore cost extra money. So the state of New Hampshire has identified 3 different categories of students who can receive extra money. This additional money is called adequacy aid. So, it's called differentiated aid because different students require different amounts of money to service their different needs. So the first category is those students who are eligible for free and reduced price meals. And it would be really natural and easy to think that the money received for students who qualify for these free and reduced price meals would be used to pay for those free and reduced price meals. That's not actually how it works out. The reimbursement for that comes from a different funding channel. But what we know is that historically, and this is painting with a broad brushstroke right now, but historically what we know and what we have found is that students who are coming from lower income families, which generally is measured by whether or not they're eligible for these free and reduced price lunches. They generally often require more services and more help in school. And so this is the way that the state of New Hampshire has decided to identify those students and be able to channel some more money into supporting their unique educational needs. So area number 2, where we give extra funding, is for students who are receiving special education services. My oldest, my 14-year-old, is one of those students in New Hampshire. They receive an additional $2,142. And for those of you who may be parents of students who receive special education services, you may laugh along with me at how small that number sounds. We're going to dig more into that later and what the number actually is for how much it costs to provide those services to students. But $2,142 is what students receive. Lewis, that is an excellent question. Students with 504s do not get any special education funding. A 504 is a different, like an academic pathway that is not funded through the state adequate education and differentiated aid formula. But that's a really good question. Before my son started receiving special education services, he was under a 504 plan to begin with. Those ones generally are given because of a medical necessity. And so the accommodations around a 504 plan are going to be based on that medical necessity, but it doesn't come with funding from this funding stream. Yeah. No, you're right. 504 students don't receive any differentiated aid. Only students who have an individualized education program, an IEP, receive that. Yeah. So the third category are English language learners. We know that if you are either are a new American or maybe you come from a family of origin or a home that isn't speaking the English language, that you require extra services to help you learn the English language so you can be successful in your schooling experience. So when we add all of these things up together, knowing that every student receives that 4182 base adequacy aid, and that some students receive one or maybe two or maybe all three of these categories of differentiated aid on top of that 4182, the average ends up working out to be almost $5,300. That's what's spent per student on all adequacy aid. But as we'll learn in an upcoming slide, the state of New Hampshire only contributes a small percentage of the actual cost of education. So what ends up happening is that local communities have to pay for that remainder by taxing their citizens. What you'll see in here is that these numbers aren't like nice rounded even numbers. That's because the legislature built in a 2% increase each year to the funding formula. Now, I want to pause for a moment and kind of poll the audience. Thinking about your costs from last year to this year, would you say it's accurate that everything in the world has only increased by like 2% or so? Not true at all, right? And that is also accurate for school systems. So when we look at the big drivers of funding in education, the big drivers of expenses in education, that's things like staff salaries, healthcare, transportation. Yeah, Kristen, cost has gone up greatly. Absolutely. All of these different things that go into building a school budget, they increase by a lot more than 2%. So I've seen stats recently coming from a few different places where some state lawmakers are saying, well, the funding formula that we have put together, this 2% increase, it will result in 31% increase over the next decade. And 31% sounds like a pretty impressive number. But when you break it down to those year over year incremental increases, it's actually not even keeping up with the rate of inflation. And what ends up happening is, because we'll see in actually the next slide, we'll see that the state of New Hampshire pays such a small percentage of that pie, the difference gets made up by local taxpayers. So last thing I want to mention about that part of it is what ends up happening with the funding formula that we just talked about is that the driver of how much money states receive comes down to the student population in each community. So because this money is allocated per pupil, when a school district loses a handful of students, or maybe even 50 or 100 students, or maybe it's 200 students if you're a really big district like Manchester, because the funding is tied to per pupil expenses, what you see sometimes, and this is true in my home city of Dover, where I sit on the school board, is that the funding from the state ends up shrinking year over year because our student population is shrinking incrementally year over year. But the problem with tying it to a student directly is that when 2 students or 12 students or 29 students leave a district, it doesn't mean that a lot of your fixed costs go down, right? If you're having 2 students leave per grade, you're not able to let go of a whole entire teacher because it's not a whole classroom worth of students from each grade that is left. You're not paying your plow guy any less or your plow woman. You're not paying your nurse any less. All of those things still have to be in place. You still have to pay bonds on the financing that you've done. You still have to pay your janitors. You still have to pay for health insurance and all of these things. So those costs don't decrease, even though that funding that's coming per student ends up decreasing. And that again results in this downshifting. So we're going to take a look at this pie chart here and see where New Hampshire education really comes from. So that green portion, you see the pretty smallish portion, that represents money coming from the state of New Hampshire. That's 18.7%. That's the smallest pie slice in the entire country. If you did this pie chart out 50 times, New Hampshire's pie chart would have the smallest amount coming from the state. I'm going to give that a moment to sink in, please, because there are many ways when we really want to be lowest in the nation, right? Lowest for crime rate. That's the kind of thing that we boast about. But being lowest for funding public education, that's not a good look for our state, and it's not a good outcome for our students as well. So the adequacy aid that we talked about, that base amount, and then those 3 buckets of differentiated aid, that's all wrapped up in that little portion of the green pie called state adequacy aid. That's the 11%. We have a little bit coming from other state aid, and then we have just under 5% coming from proceeds and profits from the lottery system. Altogether, that makes up our 18.7%. A fun fact for you is that if you line up all of the 50 states and New Hampshire's at the bottom, the next 2 lowest, that's Nebraska and South Dakota, they each contribute nearly double the percentage as what New Hampshire does. They each contribute just over 33%. So that puts us not just last, but like really, really dead last. Yeah, I know, Kristen, Oklahoma and Florida. Yeah, they do better than us. It is embarrassing. It's true. And I think that's, I testify on that a lot to say, like, we don't want to be last. That's not a good last for us. In contrast, if you did this pie chart out for the state of Vermont, 90% of their education costs are paid for by the state, which means that only a small amount is paid for by local districts. So Vermont's pie, almost entirely green. That big dark blue section that covers more than 70% of our pie, it represents the amount local taxpayers, that's you and me, whether we rent or whether we buy, we're all paying into the tax system. That amount, that 70% there, that represents $2.7 billion that you and I are directly funding. That's not million, that's billion with a B. So with such a big portion coming from the local residents, this is where we see really big differences in both the tax bills and in the academic outcomes in different districts across the state. So we're going to pause here for a moment, and I just want to point out, but we're not going to talk yet about that little portion in the lower left-hand corner of the pie chart that is labeled as swept. I'm not talking about it now on purpose. We're going to learn about it a little, and then we're going to revisit this slide and talk about how that swept portion fits into it, okay? I'm going to pause for a moment. I've done a lot of talking. Does anybody have any questions they want to raise right now? I know this is a lot of information. I'm just going to peek through the chat as well to make sure. Oh, here we go. I just saw Lisa's. Great question, Lisa. I'm going to look off my screen for a moment. I have a chart that explains that right there. So in fiscal year 22-23, that differentiated aid for third grade reading was still part of the funding formula. That year it was just under $741 per student. So that slide we looked at where it talked about those three buckets of differentiated aid, we used to have four buckets. The fourth one was the funding that students who did not meet the required reading level, the demonstration of a proficiency at the third grade level, they would receive an additional amount of funding because third grade is a benchmark year for literacy. And there has been a lot of research to indicate that if students aren't reading on grade level by third grade, that it is much harder for them to play catch up in the older grades. When there was a big reworking of the funding adequacy funding formula, that sloughed off. I wasn't part of those conversations. I don't know why it was, but it was part of the moving around of the pieces of that funding formula. So that was now 2-3 years ago that was lost. Kristen, you're asking, where do the students who have to go out of district fall into this? So students who go out of district, students who receive out of district placement services, those services are paid for by the local public education system. And that's a godsend for many parents because the average out of district tuition, when you count the tuition for wherever that student is receiving services, and then you also count the costs for transporting that student to and from those services every day, and/or a very small amount of students might have a residential placement as well in a specific district. Those costs are usually over $100,000, and that is all absorbed within the local education budget. There is a lever that school districts can pull to get some reimbursement for that. I can pause for a moment to talk about that because that's been a really timely conversation lately. There is a bucket of funding for students who receive special education services. It used to be called catastrophic aid. It has since recently been renamed special education aid. I think that renaming was probably a good choice. I don't think it's a good thing to refer to our students who require expensive services as catastrophes. So I like the renaming of it to special education aid, but just know that what you used to maybe hear referred to as catastrophic aid, this is the same bucket of money we're talking about right now. Currently, the state of New Hampshire has this bucket of money. It's $33.9 million. That number hasn't changed in the past 3 years. And it sounds like a lot of money, but it is a problematically small amount of money because what has actually been submitted for reimbursement from districts all across, yeah, Kristen, me too. Yeah, I like the name change too. And yes, other Kristen, yes, Mr. Edelblue, Commissioner Edelblue has contributed to a lot of this. So Commissioner Edelblue is the one who is making these budgetary decisions about how big that special education aid bucket is. He has chosen to keep it level funded for the past 3 years. What I can say about this past year, schools will apply for it in arrears. So whatever money has been spent for a school district, they then can apply for a reimbursement for that in the following school year. So they have to pay the money up front and then they can apply for the reimbursement. Those reimbursement requests have totaled over $50 million so far this year. Bucket of money is $33 million. So what ends up happening is, depending on how much has been submitted versus how much is there, the amount of reimbursement that the school districts can receive for those services that have been paid above and beyond 350% of the average cost of education. So in general, that's about, like, services that are above and beyond, about $75,000 per year, which for students in residential placement, they qualify in general because those are really expensive services. So for those students who have expensive services, the school district can ask for that reimbursement. But when the pot of money is smaller than the demonstrated need, schools only get a prorated portion of what they request. So just this morning, I was actually in Concord testifying on exactly this. So I can tell you, in Dover last year, where I live, what was requested was $5.7 million. What was received was, actually, I have it right here, $1.53 million. And that represents only 27% of what was requested. So it's the taxpayers in the district who make up that difference. And all of that is in general coming from within this pie right here. Let me see if we've missed anything else. Oh, Noah, thank you for adding that as well. Okay, I just want to make sure I didn't miss anybody's questions, any other new questions. Okay, let's jump back into talking about this pie because there's a little bit more to say about it. Oh, no, actually, no, I think we finished talking about the pie. Noah, can you advance to the next slide where we talk about a comparison of the two different? Perfect, thank you. So in this next slide, what we're going to look through is two different school districts. And these are not made up numbers. These are actual real numbers from the 2002 to 2003 school year. We get data from the state we're about half a year off from when the school year ends. So just in the past week, we got the newest data for the 2003 to 2004 school year. So this data is from that prior year to that. These are two real districts in the state of New Hampshire. So I'm going to let you look at these numbers, and then I'd like you to throw out some guesses about which districts you think are District A and which are District B. Okay, so let's take a look at how they compare. Students in District A, yeah, Zandra, it is painful. You're absolutely right. Students in District A, they're performing well in third grade. They're graduating at a high rate. They're scoring well on their advanced placement exams. Their teachers are paid well. That means they're more likely to stay in the district until they retire. And this is really important. We're going to come back to this after we talk about District B. This community in District A, it's a wealthier one based on the median household income. It's close to $100,000. These are the schools that often win the educational awards for top student performance. So we're now going to contrast that profile with District B, where student performance and graduation rates are much lower. The teacher pay, the median household income, also significantly lower. And this district is more likely to have staff turnover. Now, why does that matter so much? It's because a consistent and supportive relationship with a trusted teacher in school is one of the most important factors in student success. I see Lewis's head nodding, and I know you know this. I know you know this. You spoke about this at the rally on Tuesday. That consistent, trusted presence of an adult in high school can often be that one protective factor that really shields a student from a lot of other stuff that they may be dealing with. It's hard when a staff is turning over at the rate of 1/3 every year, which is a statistic that actually happens in the districts that are paying their teachers the lowest. When staff turns over that high, students don't have the continuity of care from one year to the next. So those trusted teachers are forced for their own sake, for their own livelihood, to leave the district to go in search of higher pay in other districts. And that's a real travesty for sure, but it's a reality for districts who pay near the bottom of that salary range. Okay, I want to direct your attention now to the line second from the bottom. That's the local education property taxes. Do the numbers surprise you? District A has a much lower, nearly a third rate of District B, which is significantly higher. And what that translates to is that on houses that are valued the similar amount of $350,000, the tax bill in District A is significantly lower than the tax bill in District B. Now, as we have already talked about, this is directly related to how much property wealth each community has. So communities with those expensive properties, they can afford to have low tax rates. Because the properties are generally more expensive, they still can raise enough to pay top dollar for their schools. What does top dollar get you? Well, we can see what it gets you in District A versus District B. The opposite's true too, right? In poorer towns with that low property value, they have fewer attractions, they have a declining business market, maybe. Taxes are often really high, and their schools are still poorly funded despite the high taxes. These schools are the ones that usually offer students fewer opportunities because they just literally can't afford to pay for them, not because they think their students deserve less or because they care less about their students. When the money's not there, the money's not there, even though both districts might have the same high ideals. All right, I'm seeing some. I saw there was Derry, there was Bedford. Yeah, a couple other people have asked about Bedford. It's a great guess. Want to take a look? Let's see. So it's Portsmouth and Claremont. I want you to pay attention, especially to that column on the right with Claremont. That is going to come up in the next part of our conversation. So let's think about it. What does Portsmouth have that Claremont doesn't? Portsmouth is on the water. Portsmouth has wonderful commerce, shopping, tourism revenue. They have amazing restaurants. They have a really a great like restaurant scene, art scene. They have wonderful hotels, shopping, theater. As a result, they have very high property values. Noah, let's pop into the next one right here. Okay, now that we've thought about the differences in academic outcomes between a community like Portsmouth and a community like Claremont, I want to take us back in time about 30 years ago to the early 90s when the state of New Hampshire was sued by a collection of schools that likely would have been those column B districts. In fact, Claremont was the title district upon which the Claremont rulings were based. So Claremont was the main community that sued this district, or that sued the state, but it wasn't just Claremont, it was also Pittsfield and Lisbon and Franklin and Allenstown as well. Oh, Kristen, just you wait. We're going to get into Allenstown. That is coming right up. That was a beautiful segue. Thank you for mentioning that. We're going to talk all about Allenstown next. The court case was referred to as the Claremont case because it was Claremont. Their taxes were much higher and the schools were much worse than many other districts. So they took their complaints to the court. And as the next slide will show, what ended up happening is that after a long 7 years, the Claremont rulings came back in favor of these school districts. These were monumentally important rulings, and there were two key factors that we could pull out that have been important up to this day when we talk and think about school funding. The first was that the court ruled that the state of New Hampshire has a duty to pay for the cost of a constitutionally adequate education. That word adequate keeps coming up, and it's all based on the ruling that came from the court that said New Hampshire has to fund an adequate education for every K-12 public school student. The second component of that, and this is the part that that started changing the funding formula, is that the taxes that the state uses to pay for this providing of an adequate education has to have a uniform rate across the state. That was the chief complaint in the Claremont case, is that districts in different parts of the state were taxed at different rates, and that was unfair to the students and to the taxpayers. So the Claremont rulings, they were monumental. Up until this point, every city and state, or every city and town had different tax rates. And after Claremont, the state created a new tax mechanism called the statewide education education property tax. And I'm counting it out because we very frequently use the acronym SWEPT, SWEPT. So when we in the future refer to SWEPT, we're talking about the statewide education property tax. This was a mechanism to help the state comply with the Claremont rulings. This SWEPT tax was a property tax because remember, that's how New Hampshire is funding public education, is through property tax. So it was a new statewide tax, meaning everyone in the state had the same tax rate no matter where they lived. It was originally set at $6.60 per $1,000 of assessed property value. So on a home that would be worth $100,000 back then, that would be a $660 bill. You times the 100 of the 100,000 by $6.60. Now, despite this being a new tax, which I think can sound scary at the outset to a lot of people who are thinking, well, new tax means higher bill. Despite it being a new tax, most taxpayers actually saw a decrease in their overall tax bill, because with the swept bill taking up a larger piece of that funding pie, what ended up happening is that it was the wealthy communities that ended up starting to have to pay their fair share. And when they started paying their fair share, that released pressure off of the communities who formerly had been paying too much of their fair share. Now, over the years, a few things have happened here. A little over a decade ago, a coalition of those wealthy towns that had to pay more in swept tax got together and they lobbied the state to change the rules so that their towns didn't have to send all of that swept tax to the State Department. And instead, every district got to keep that money. Additionally, that $6.60 in swept, that over time has been whittled away. And that tax rate today is only just a little over $1 per thousand of assessed value. Now, only a small portion of the education costs are coming from swept. So in fact, now we're going to go back to that previous slide and we're going to look at the pie chart again. So now back to the pie chart. Now let's think about, now that we know what swept is, we can take a look and see that with that only just over $1 per assessed thousand of value, the statewide education property tax is only paying for under 10% of the true cost of education. The swept tax also now is kept by each individual community, and it's not sent to the state for redistribution to the towns that need it the most. And because of that, it's exactly no equity, Kristen. Yes. And for that reason, even though the state has called it a statewide education property tax, you notice it's not included in the green portion of state taxes because it is a locally raised tax that is kept locally and is spent only on the local districts. So it, in effect, is a local tax. We have correctly identified it in this pie chart as part of local property tax. All right, let's move on to our next slide. We're going to look now at how this plays out in real districts across the state. So this chart shows 3 different New Hampshire towns compared to the state average. We're looking at Hopkinton, Pittsfield, and New London. The green bars, they represent how much each district is actually spending on it. Together represent the adequacy aid the state contributes. Remember that base aid plus those 3 buckets of differentiated aid if the students qualify. So that together, oh, can everyone still hear me okay? I just got a notification that my internet was unstable. If I get choppy for some reason, it always makes me nervous.
You're cutting out slightly here and there just recently, that just started about a minute ago.
Oh, okay. All right. If I start getting choppy again, I'll just go off camera and maybe that will help with my voice staying clear. Okay, so those yellow and blue bars, that's what the state says is required for a school to provide an adequate education. And remember, every district is going to be different because that adequacy number is based on the makeup of the student population. Some districts have more students who are living in poverty or requiring special education or learning the English language. Others have fewer. The very tiny blue bar at the bottom, that shows how much money is raised through swept. It's a tiny amount, super tiny at the bottom. Remember, the green bar, that's what it's actually costing to fund education within those towns. So usually after communities raise their swept funds, that doesn't cover the amount that the state says is required for an adequate public education. So the yellow bars, they represent that difference that the state will make up. That together is considered the adequacy aid. Now, let's take a look at New London, all the way on the right. Their blue swept tax bar is very high compared to the other towns on the graph. Why is that? It's because New London is a very property wealthy town. In fact, that blue amount, that's much higher than the $1.45 million that the state of New Hampshire says New London students require for that adequate education. They're raising a lot more. But remember now, swept taxes are raised locally, kept locally, and spent on local expenses only. So the state of New Hampshire, they don't give New London any additional money, but New London gets to keep all that money for themselves. What does that end up doing for New London students? It helps them make their schools even better. But at whose expense? And that's the question right there. So I want, it isn't sustainable, Christian. You're right. You're absolutely right. I want to pause for additional questions. I've done a lot of talking, and I'm going to turn it over to Noah now, who's going to kind of walk us through the back half of our presentation together. Does anybody have any questions before we transition? Thanks, Sandra. All right. So we'll keep moving on. Keep continuing to add your comments and questions in the chat, please. I'm going to turn it over to Noah now.
All right. Thank you, Michaela. So, um, this big gap that exists between the actual costs and the actual expenditures that school districts are making and what they're receiving from the state, um, that is the problem with low state funding and our heavy reliance on local property taxes. This is where the inequities in property value really show themselves as districts try and close that gap between the tall bar and the short bar. So, um, how much is the short bar is adequacy actually worth? You know, the state has said that it's supposed to be enough for an adequate education, but what can that money actually pay for in the real world? So we asked this hypothetical question to the Allenstown School District. Allenstown, they were one of the plaintiff districts in the Claremont suit. They're kind of a small district. They only had a little over 500 students during the 2022-2023 school year. And the voters in Allenstown approved a $12.2 million budget that year. So they had their school district meeting, people came out and voted. That is what the voters decided that they were going to spend on their school district. The state in the same year calculated that an adequate education for Allenstown only cost $2.4 million. So we asked Allenstown, if you had to cut your budget down from 12.2 million approved by the voters to 2.4 million, a so-called adequate education, what would you have to cut to actually get there? So let's see what that took to get there. For starters, there's no busing. Special education busing is gone if there's students who maybe have an out-of-district placement. There's no supplies or copy machines, no art, music, or PE equipment, no Chromebook technology, no food service, no grounds maintenance, including plowing. So if it snows, kids maybe have to bring a shovel to school to be able to get into the building. They're not going to pay for the superintendent and staff and any attorneys for the school district. Already, we're breaking a number of laws. So busing is required by the state for grades 1 to 8 for students who live more than 1.5 miles from the school. By having no busing at all, we're violating state law. The one that is really scary on here also is we're going to default on the bond that we paid for the school building. I don't really know what would happen if a school district defaulted on its bond. Ostensibly, the bank would repossess the school, but that's something we hopefully are never going to have to find out. And this is a lot of stuff that we're already have taken out, and we are not even close to being done. We're getting rid of all English language learner support, which means we're now violating federal law also. We're going to get rid of all special education contracted services. So any contracted services that are being paid to come into the district is now going to have to provide those services themselves to continue to be in compliance with federal mandates. We're going to get rid of out-of-district placements. We're going to get rid of special education appraisal services. And then kind of beyond that, there's not going to be any clubs, sports field trips, no summer programs. We're going to fire some secretaries and custodians. We're going to lay off one of the nurses. There's no guidance counselor. We're going to fire both crossing guards. So we're getting rid of the buses and we're getting rid of the crossing guards. So students are entirely on their own in terms of getting safely into the school building. And we're going to get rid of 2 of the 17 special education paraprofessionals. And we're going to cut the special education coordinator to half-time. This is a lot of stuff. We're breaking state and federal law by laying off some custodians. We are really violating probably a local collective bargaining agreement that's been ratified by the school board and the voters at town meeting. And it continues. We're going to fire the speech and language pathologist. We're not going to pay substitute teachers. So that means if enough teachers are sick, the school's just going to be closed. If you can't have enough adults in the building to make sure it's safe for students, they're just going to close. And parents aren't going to be too happy when they get that call at 5:30 in the morning that school is not happening. We're going to get rid of a reading specialist, the special education secretary, fire the librarian. I think the speech language pathologist is on here twice. No art teacher, music teacher, phys ed teacher, no behavior teacher, 1 of the 7 special education teachers. So we have cut a lot. And it's still not even enough. The next thing that had to go, Allenstown does not have their own high school. They educate students K through 8 in their own district, and they tuition students to Pembroke Academy. During the 22-23 school year, Allenstown paid Pembroke $2.2 million in tuition for their roughly 150 high school students. They can't control the line item, so they're going to cut it. And that means an adequate education in Allenstown ends in the 8th grade. And still, we aren't at the end. To get down to what the state has said an adequate education costs, we need to cut about half of the remaining teachers. And we're going to have class sizes that are larger than the state standards that we have to be following. So the Allenstown superintendent, their finance person, and one of their school board members did this exercise for us, and they felt that, based on the state's definition of an adequate education, classroom teachers were really at the core of it. But even then, we still have to lay off half of the staff, and we have class sizes that violate the minimum standards for New Hampshire schools. And this really begs the question, with everything gone, how can we possibly say this is an adequate education for Allenstown? That the state is claiming that $2.4 million is enough. The voters are spending 12.4, and clearly adequacy aid is insufficient to actually fulfill even the most basic standards and requirements that the state puts on public schools. So it's clear that what the state is paying, even all these years after the Claremont lawsuits, is still insufficient to actually be educating our students. So I am going to shift gears a little bit and talk specifically just about special education funding. Michaela started to touch on this before. During the 22-23 school year, there were 175,405 students in New Hampshire public schools. 30,964 of them were receiving special education services through an IEP. Total education expenditures in the state was $3.8 billion, and special education services accounted for 915 million of that total amount. I'm about to show you another pie chart, and I want you to guess if the state's piece of the pie, just for special education aid, looks similar or different to the pie chart that we've already looked at. It's almost exactly the same. The state and federal government are contributing about 17.5% of all the funding for special education in the state of New Hampshire. The rest of it is generated through local property taxes. Um, so some quick facts about this and how we've gotten here. That 17.5% from the state and federal government is actually down from the year prior. 60 school districts in the state spend more than a quarter of their budget on special education, the highest proportion being in Benton, which was 45%. The average cost to educate a student who has an IEP is almost $48,000 for the year, which is an average cost of $18,000, which is just the general education expenses divided by the total number of students in the state, plus an additional $29,000 associated exclusively with the services related to fulfilling their IEP. Meanwhile, the state is contributing only $3,000 per pupil on average. You'll remember the differentiated aid category for special education was a little over $2,100. The extra $1,000 in this $3,000 per pupil comes from like the special education aid fund, which Michaela has already talked about. That accounts for just 3% of the total funding for special education in the state. So it's a microcosm of education funding in the state as a whole. And one of the things that we see and have seen, happening in town meetings for the last couple of years is these costs have been going up around the state. They can be hard to budget for school districts when you have ever-changing student enrollments and needs. And that can make it challenging to actually put your budget together. And it can put districts in really difficult situations where all of a sudden they have a student who moves into town and is entitled to services, and the district has to pay for it. And they should pay for it. It's important that we are providing services that students need so that they can succeed just as their peers can. As as far as the state goes, if the state is ensuring that all students have an adequate education, they need to be ensuring that special education students have the resources that they need to access the same education as their peers. That all students have access to the resources that they need to succeed in the school building or out of the school building if they're being placed out of district. The state has admitted that it costs more money to provide those services by having a differentiated aid category for those students. And clearly, it's not following through on actually ensuring that students are getting the services that they need to receive an adequate education. So while this is frustrating, this piece of legislation from last year is still actually also a frustration because it didn't pass ultimately. This bill was proposed to increase the differentiated aid payment for students receiving special education services to $27,000 per pupil, which would I forget the percentage, it would drastically increase the state's share of special education funding. Ultimately, it was amended down quite a bit, all the way down to only $17.5 million additional. And that passed the House in a landslide because it was barely any money. And then the Senate wanted to double it a little bit. And then ultimately, it was referred to interim study, which is a polite way of killing the bill in the legislature. So even just a tiny little amount, a tiny little increase to special education aid to help alleviate some of that, some of the costs that are being placed onto local property taxpayers that the state has a responsibility to be paying for, even that the state legislature couldn't do last year. We should point out that people were mobilized. People came out for this bill. There was a lot of really great testimony from people on this bill. And the thing we have to do now is continue pushing for changes on special education funding and on all education funding in the state. And there are a group of people who have kind of taken that a step further, even beyond just advocating at the legislature. They sued the state. In 2022, a group of 5 taxpayers from Plymouth, Newport, Pennacook, and Hopkinton, all places that have below average property values, which means that they're hurt by our current funding system. They sued the state and argue that because local education tax rates vary wildly around the state, that violates the standard defined in the Claremont lawsuits that taxes for education, which is a state responsibility, need to be uniform in rate. And so they're challenging both the tax system as well as the amount that the state pays in adequacy aid and differentiated aid, saying that it's not enough, and that it should be closer to actually reflecting real world costs associated with schools. Um, I'm talking about the Rand lawsuit. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the Conval lawsuit, the other lawsuit that's happening right now. That one was filed by the Conval School District in 2019, has since been joined by 18 other districts, now representing 25% of the students in the state. That case had oral arguments at the New Hampshire Supreme Court in December. And we're just awaiting a decision from the court. I'm not really getting into that case here just because it only has to do with base adequacy aid. It doesn't touch any of the differentiated aid categories. So that's why, given our time constraints, I didn't end up getting into both of them. But at the heart of the Rand lawsuit, what their plaintiffs are arguing is that because the state has said that we need differentiated aid, that some students need more resources to receive an adequate education, the fact that they are so woefully underfunding those differentiated aid categories means that they are not actually providing students with a constitutionally adequate education. I'm not sure if that might be the bill for this year, Lewis. I still am learning all of the numbers and we're still getting some of the bill text. So I can look after. Um, so I'm gonna come back to this slide to kind of start wrapping us up. I'm not sure where this red line on my screen came from, if I'm being honest. I don't know how long that's been there. Um, anyway, so the rant plaintiffs are arguing that the base adequacy amount, the $4,182 per pupil, that needs to be higher. And they're also arguing that these 3 categories of differentiated aid also need to be higher and need to actually reflect the costs associated with providing students an adequate education. So thinking about English language learners, $816 is not a lot of money, especially for English language learners who maybe don't speak any English at all and might not spend any time in a general education setting during a school year. Similarly, as we've already discussed, the special education differentiated aid is woefully inadequate for actually covering the cost of services being provided to students. It's very clear that the money that the state is providing, this average that they're providing in adequacy aid is not enough to actually give students an adequate education. I think the Rand plaintiffs would say that this average amount of state adequacy aid should be much closer to the actual average cost of educating students in New Hampshire. And at the very least, it needs to be enough to fulfill all of the state and federal mandates that school districts have to follow to actually be able to operate and to provide students with an education. So being conscious of the time and to wrap us up, a couple closing thoughts that I hope you can all take with you, and I'll make sure I email the slides to Lewis and he can share them around, put them on the website for anyone who wants to access them. In a recap, how do we fund education in New Hampshire? Mostly local property taxes, with rates varying a lot by district and really being dependent on property values in a community. And if you add all those up, it's $2.7 billion being generated by local property taxpayers every year to support our schools. Why is this unfair? With different property values, different tax rates comes different academic opportunities and student outcomes. The The places that have higher taxes are not able to spend more money on their schools. They are not able to necessarily have better student outcomes. Um, How's special education affected? The state contributes very little money to supporting special education, and so taxpayers are footing the cost of it. And if you are in a situation where a student, a high need student moves into a district, a school board might be forced to make a decision between cutting services somewhere else so that they are providing students with the services that they're entitled to, or they're going to be increasing taxes outside of the normal budget cycle. And at the heart of this is you have the power to actually make a change and to talk to your legislators. We have a lot of legislators, and they want to listen to you. They want to hear from you. Your voice, sharing your story, testifying at hearings, submitting testimonies, it makes a real impact. When people show up at the State House, legislators listen. If you call your legislator on the phone, they will listen to you. If you send them an email, they will listen to you. They don't have, at the end of the day, that many constituents. The ratio is about one representative for every 300 or 3,000 people. You can have a really outsized impact on the direction of policy in the state just by picking up the phone and talking to your legislator. If you can't make it up to the State House during the day for hearings. So there's a lot of opportunities to get engaged. I'd encourage people to visit our website where you can sign up for our newsletter at fairfundingnh.org if you are interested. In being notified about opportunities to testify and share your story on important bills dealing with all different facets of education funding over the next couple of months. And I will leave it there. I see that we are at a little past 7 o'clock. I'm happy to stay for another couple minutes and answer any questions people might have, but also recognize that, you might want to have the rest of your evening back to yourself. But yes, with the hand raise, if you'd like to say your name and introduce yourself for everyone.
Sure, this is Kathy Spinney. My daughter was involved in special education for all her academic life, and everything you've covered is obviously troubling, but it's not new. None of this is new. Decades old of an issue. So in your experience, who have you identified that really cares, particularly for special ed kids? Who cares? Are you finding people that care? Because we sure haven't for decades. That's my question.
Yeah, I think it's a really troubling question. I think it is easier to care and to make a personal connection when personal stories are shared. And that's why the lived experience of people who are encountering hurdles or encountering roadblocks in the way that our public education system is set up for students with disabilities is so vital to be able to share those experiences. There was a lot of power, I think, in the gathering that ABLE and Moms Rising put together on Tuesday morning at the State House. There is an exhausting amount of work that goes into advocacy, and I think that is the kind of understood current among all advocates for many years. I mean, there was so much advocacy that happened in the 70s to even put about the implementation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act back then, way back at the genesis of disability rights. It took a lot of people being really loud for a long time and refusing to stop before there was no opportunity but to pay attention and but to answer the questions and make the changes. And I think that is our call to you all today is help us get loud. We are ready to get loud. We are ready to share the data, the real life stories and examples of how this system is impacting, negatively impacting families and students. And so we really hope you join us in that. I'm not going to lie and say that it's a quick fix or that it's easy or that it's heartening. It is generally none of those, but it is important work. it is necessary work. And so we do the hard work anyway, even though we are exhausted and disheartened
So
to do it at
when
times.
you're reaching out to decision makers, legislators, the only real way to solve this, if we want to be honest, got to be honest, is a broad-based tax of kind. It's the only way. You're not going to do it with bake sales and, you know, increasing the alcohol tax a percent. It's not going to happen that way. There's too many people here with too many profound needs for a long period of time. And you've got senior citizens who've lived in their home for 50 years who can't live in them anymore because they just can't pay their taxes. Their house is paid for. That's not sustainable with the patchwork of jokingly small taxes. And then the biggest taxes we have are being cut now, the business taxes. So nobody at the decision-making level is going to say to you, yep, we're going to have a sales tax or an income tax. It's not going to happen in my experience. And I've been an advocate for decades. So I know a lot of the people that I'm sure you're talking to. That's not going to happen. And sadly, the state has, since I moved here over 40 years ago, it's really changed in character from a largely middle-class state to a very elitist state. And a lot of the people who've moved in with money can afford to send their kids anywhere, even if they have special needs. They can hire private people. That's why I'm saying to you, really finding anyone at the decision-making level who will commit to what it's going to take to do this right. And I would love it to be yes, but I have not seen evidence in all my years of advocacy at the State House. So mostly my advocacy has mostly been for adult services because my daughter hasn't been in school since the early 2000s. But just what's the plan? You know, I get people, you know, active and talking to legislators, and the personal stories help, but I don't think that alone is going to get us there. So why isn't the DRC suing towns or suing the state and, or the Civil Liberties Union, some big entity with a lot of high profile saying, you guys are breaking so many laws. Sorry, you're going to have to tax your citizenry in an equitable fashion and force us to do it. And I don't see any of that happen. Was any of that work going on?
I mean, I think this feels like the right time to say two things. The first of which is that we are a nonpartisan organization, so we do not advocate for or against any specific candidate. That said, what I will say is all these decisions are being made by elected state legislators. The people who are in the positions of power are put there by the people, you and me, who come out to the polls and vote for them. So while we are a nonpartisan organization, and while we will never, ever advocate for or against any specific candidate, we do have a fantastic resource that we just recently put out with it was a joint partnership between our organization and Reaching Higher New Hampshire. And it is a guide that actually, Noah, are you able to pull up, do we have that in an online version? Are you able to find that URL? If not,
Yes.
we can also include that in the email that we send to Lewis with the slides. It is a resource that is designed to help regular citizens like you and me have good, honest conversations with the people who are in positions of power, because I think it can be really hard to get anywhere when you talk with someone. And I don't have a great answer to your question, unfortunately, Kathy. I think that is...
Well, it was more rhetorical. I really didn't expect that you did, because you'd be sharing the good news from the rooftop.
If there was an easy, great solution, someone long before me would have already thought of it and done it. And that is the hard part.
Yeah, it's not easy. There's just not a willingness.
Yeah, I see Carrie's hands up next. I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you for your question.
You may have put out something about this earlier with the forms you put in the chat, but I needed I'm looking for a tool as an advocate, as a parent, to be able to speak with my local legislators who are the head sponsors of the education freedom accounts. And how do I, in a nonpartisan way, speak to our legislators? Yes, they know my daughter personally, but it isn't it doesn't seem to be reaching them. So I want to meet them at their level, and I'm just kind of looking for a resource to be able to say, okay, you want the education freedom accounts, you want to pull that funding, but here's how it's affecting my daughter. And I'm really not sure how to bring all that together. And I didn't know if you offered anything like that.
Carrie, if you are looking to get in touch with the I can direct you. I just put here a link to the page for the Education Funding Committee. They're the ones where the public hearing was today on HB 115. There's contact information on here to get in touch with the members of that committee. As far as the like specific sponsors of, there's a number of bills dealing with vouchers this session. That's harder for me to pull together very quickly, but this is a good starting place. If you would like to send an email to these committee members, now that they've had a public hearing on HB 115, they're going to have some deliberations and an executive session where they will vote on it. So you, if you can get in touch with them before they vote on it, they hopefully will, take your contact into account.
Also, Carrie, sorry, this is Kristen with ABLE. We offer trainings to help you get ready to testify. We can also, testify, but even speak with your elected officials. So if you need any assistance, feel free to reach out to me or ABLE, and we can draft talking points. I can train you on how to, speak and what they want, what they don't want, and how to do it. So you could also reach out to ABLE, New Hampshire.
And Carrie, even though we don't know each other all that well, my understanding of you is that you are a fierce advocate who is already a really well represented voice advocating for the disability community. So my guess is that you have done a lot of really great work advocating already. The one thing I'll add to this, just because it's so relevant and timely, is I was one of the people who spoke today in opposition to HB 115, which was the proposition to expand the current education freedom account voucher program to universal acceptance without any income limit at all. And I thought very carefully about how I message. And I think that's maybe what I heard you asking in your question is how, when we're speaking, how do we message so that it is an effective message? And what I chose to do in my testimony was to focus on the aspect of fiscal responsibility, or in this case, I proposed that it was fiscally irresponsible to expand the Education Freedom Account program when we have a demonstrated need within our special education student community for funding that we are not currently receiving, and gave specific examples from my district where what we have actually spent on special education is not being reimbursed at an adequate level from the state. And so that was the avenue I took to talk about this, not making value judgments on vouchers themselves, not talking about anything from kind of a hyperbolic or like this side versus this side, but really just talking about the fiscal responsibility that our state needs to have, especially now when, as somebody mentioned earlier, we have we're looking at a budget shortfall this year because of the repeal of things like the interest and dividends tax. So I tried to keep it very numbers-based and facts-based. And I think that messaging can appeal to members across a wide range on the political spectrum as well. And we know we have that. And that's the reality of what we're dealing with when we're doing advocacy, is tailoring our message to be able to appeal to people who might be coming from different perspectives, I think is really essential. So I tried to keep it just the facts and tried to keep it to to just the numbers, because the numbers don't lie. The numbers aren't based on emotion or opinion or lived experience. They are what they are. So that was what I did today. I hope that helps. Any other questions from anyone?
I thought there was one more, Kristen.
Hi, sorry. I think my question would just kind of follow up with that. Many parents of disabled children with special needs in the state, they're already burnt out, but there's powers in numbers, and many people don't understand legalese and how to navigate this whole budgets and bills and understand how that affects their children. And do you have templates of emails that I can give to families that I know in Concord that can help more people reach out? Do you guys have that available on a website or anything? Or I didn't know if there's anything like a easy, like, this is how you reach out to your state rep. This is how you do this, locally. So maybe if they can't show up or they don't really know what to write, there's a template there for them, especially with the bills now. As you guys know, you were there today. We have serious things happening. I mean, it's scary. And who knows if they don't pass this year, if they pass next year. We're looking at a scary upcoming 2 years in the state. So I just didn't know if there's any templates out there. If not, I'm willing to put in any work that you guys would need voluntarily to write any templates to help families. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Kristen. I would say we don't have one of those right this very second, but there's absolutely going to be some that are focused on special education coming down the pipe as that legislation starts to have its public hearings and starts to be heard by committees. We try and put together tools that make it easy for you to email your representatives or the members of a committee, depending on when we're asking people to get engaged. And that tool does come with, we always put in like some sample text that can help you get started if you don't know what to say, or give someone that starting point if they've never contacted their legislators before and maybe don't know where to begin. So there definitely will be some of that. We don't have any right this second. I mean, we're still waiting for some of the bill text on these bills just to be released, and it's difficult for us to be putting that together until we can read what these bills are actually going to do. But definitely stay tuned. There will be some of that coming from us.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I
Thank
do
you.
also just want to flag a couple links I just dropped in. Our one of our other team members has created something that is not exactly what you were describing, but similar enough that I think it's a resource worth sharing. It's a tool and a guide to help you tell your story. And then there's also an opportunity to be able to submit that to our team if you'd like us to share that on behalf of you. And there are also ways for you to upload your testimony directly to support or oppose specific bills that are up for public hearing in the House as well.
Elizabeth, and then maybe we can hand it over to Lewis to wrap us up.
I just wanted to say Parent Information Center, New Hampshire Family Voices websites have templates for testifying, if that's helpful.
That is, thank you.
And I'll just say, I'm not a funding expert. I have so many numbers jumbled in my head once again because of you two. So I'm learning this. But today, the approach that I took when I testified was more on inclusion. And there's a lot of research out there that these, school choice programs throughout the country do exclude students with disabilities. A student with a disability will have to forego their IDEA to accept EFAs. So, and the amount, the $4,000-5,000 that you might be getting does not equate to the amount that you would be getting within the school system for speech and language. A lot of the testifying or testimony today was about just dissatisfaction with public schools. That was kind of the general consensus that I got, and people wanted to just have that freedom of choice. And I feel really strongly that when we invest in our public schools, they're better. But I just want to thank Michaela and Noah. This was a fantastic presentation. You both have been fantastic, and your whole organization has been fantastic all week. I think Able is very fortunate to have you all as partners in this battle. And for everybody here, we'll be posting the link to the video because I have so many things that I want to go back and learn about. And also hopefully the PowerPoint too. And I'll just leave with some closing remarks. Legislators are hard to connect with, as we all know. They all have their priorities, but reaching out to your neighbor, if you see somebody, especially in our disability community that might not be involved, telling them and helping them educate and guiding them to resources like this is very helpful because while your legislator votes at the state house, your neighbor votes for the legislator. So the more we could do to educate our neighbors and our friends, that would take a step in the right direction. So I want to thank you all just one more time, and thank you all for coming. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank
Bye,
you
guys.
all. Have a good night.
You too.